from Esther chapter 4. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning amongst the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain to her and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. And Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise from the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him.
As Chris has already told you, we've been studying through the book of Esther, and that event that it was going to, if it was carried out, destroy the Jewish nation throughout the vast Persian Empire. Now, we must try to grasp the size of this empire. It stretched from Abyssinia all the way across to the borders of India. And there were 127 different provinces, different nations, if you like, included in that great empire. Virtually the whole of the Jewish race that existed at that time would have been included in that empire. They would be citizens of that empire. So that if the attempt to eradicate them had been successful, there would not have been any Jewish race left. It would have been quite impossible for the Messiah, for the Christ, to be born to a Jewish woman in Judea, as of course he was. So God's ancient promises promises made long before these events took place, 500 BC, right about that time. And way back, God had made promises to his people that there would be a Christ, that there would be a Messiah, and that through him all nations of the earth would be blessed. So God's promises would not have succeeded. God's promises would have failed if the plan of this Jew-hating man called Haman had come to fruition. Now, we started to look at the detail of Haman's plan. He had almost certainly been a Jew-hater since his infancy. As soon as he was old enough to understand what it meant to be a descendant of Agag, the king of the Amalekites, when he asked, why do I call myself an Agagite, he would have been told of the fact that the Jews, when they possessed the promised land 1,000 years before, had been told by God to eliminate the Amalekite tribe. The Jews had been told to do that simply because of the utter wickedness of that tribe. But more of that later. Now, this man Haman had worked very hard to obtain high office as to be able to exercise enough power in the government to bring about the destruction of the Jews. And he had succeeded. And he had obtained the permission of the king to carry out this murderous plot. And he had not only obtained permission from the king, but he had obtained the actual signet ring from the king, which had to be impressed upon any new law. And so he had the signet ring, and that was, he had the authority of the throne. He had the permission of the king, because he had lied to the king about the Jews. And he was therefore in total control of events. And for my first point, that first point is Haman pursues his plan. And then I will follow that with the Jews petition their God. And thirdly, Mordecai and Esther prepare a defense. Now, the first thing I want to pick up in our continuation of a detailed examination of Haman's plan is the question of payment. Who actually was going to pay the enormous costs of the logistics of this scheme? It was going to cost an enormous amount of money to not only get the message out through couriers and by people traveling on foot or horseback through 3,000 miles of the Persian Empire. It was going to cost a lot of money. And Haman, we are told, if you read the earlier verses, Haman promised and delivered to the king a large sum of money. Let me read just 3 verses from chapter 3. Haman says, "If it please the king, let it be decreed that they," that is the Jews, "be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries." Those 10,000 talents of silver probably equivalent to about £3 million today, or $5 million. We can't tell exactly. Now, most commentators on the book of Esther treat this gift to the king's treasury of £3 million as a bribe, something to persuade the king to go along with Haman's plans. But that is a total mistake. If you read on in verse 11 of Esther 3, the king said to Haman, "The money is given to you." The people also, that is the Jews also, have been given into Haman's hands to do with them as it seems good to you. But now just a minute. Haman gives the king £3 million into his treasury, and then 2 verses later the king says, "The money is yours, take it and use it as you want to." So who was giving the money? Well, the fact is, of course, that this was never a bribe to the king. It was a very cunning scheme that Haman had thought out, meaning that when the money was eventually paid out, it came from the king's treasury. Therefore, it was the plan to eradicate the Jews was formally a decision of the king. It was a government matter. So if anything went wrong, Haman wouldn't be to blame, it would be the king who was to blame. The king thought he'd escaped the responsibility by handing everything over to Haman, and Haman very cleverly handed the responsibility back to the king by giving him the money, putting it into his treasury, and then taking it out again, so that the actual payment eventually, finally came from the king's treasury. It was an official governmental action to eradicate the Jews. Well, that gives some idea of the way that Haman was very cleverly scheming and getting his way. The next thing we need to look at is the wording of the edict. You see, the king, having given Haman all of this power, he left it to Haman to write the law. Haman composed the edict for the destruction of the Jews, and he signed it himself, because he had the signet ring. And he signed it in the king's name, of course, but he was in total control of the situation. In verse 12, we read that he sent it to every one of the 127 provinces in their local languages. It had to be translated into, I don't know whether it was 127 languages, but quite a lot of different languages were involved. And the instructions to annihilate the Jews, all Jews, to annihilate all Jews, young or old, no matter what their color or race, their local situation was. It was an instruction from the king to the leaders of the provinces to circulate this information to all the population, to the population in general. So this was a mammoth undertaking. There was to be a total and utter destruction. Now, before we pass moral judgment on that, there might be an objection. And that objection is this: well, wasn't Haman only doing to the Jews what 1,000 years before the Israelites had done to the Amalekites, to his forebears? So wasn't Haman simply doing to the Jews now, in 500 BC, what had been done to their forefathers 800 years before by God's instruction to the Jews? Was that not poetic justice? And if Haman was morally responsible for this, was not God morally responsible for what happened 800 years before? But that is a completely wrong understanding of the situation. If you look at the motives, Haman's motive was one of hatred. He hated the Jews. And because he hated the Jews, he wanted them destroyed. He committed a sin. God hates hatred. And that is a very deep-dyed sin. Whereas God, of course, cannot sin. God is perfect. He is without sin. And so when God commanded the Jews to destroy the Amalekites, he was doing something that was necessary and moral and in no way sinful. And the reason, of course, was that the Amalekites, in their practices and in their religion, perpetrated the most terrible crimes, child sacrifices, and other unspeakable crimes against humanity and morality. So here is the answer, and there is an application here for us. God does hate hatred. Many statements, actually, in the New Testament and in the Old Testament also, to some degree. Let me quote from Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 to 45. The Lord Jesus says this, "You have heard it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemies.' But I say to you, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who despitefully use you." And he continues. And then a little later, in Matthew 5, verses 21 to 22, "You have heard it was said, 'You shall not murder.' But I, Jesus, say to you, whoever is angry with his brother without a cause is in danger of the judgment." And so there is an application for us. Haman's great sin basically was hatred. And God condemns hatred. God says, no, we must not hate our enemies. We must not hate those who despise us or look down upon us. We must not hate, we must love and pray for these people who are hating us. Now that, of course, is a tremendous challenge, isn't it? Because although we may not experience hatred as such, many people in the world do, of course, experience hatred, but nevertheless, we do experience the cold shoulder that is often offered to Christians. We experience the bad things which are said about us untruly. Early part of Matthew chapter 5, the Lord is saying, blessed are those who do this and do that. And he finishes up with the statement, blessed are you when all men speak ill of you falsely for my name's sake. Rejoice greatly, because so they treated the prophets before you. And so there's no doubt about God's attitude to any kind of hatred, to any kind of criticism, if you like, unjust criticism of other people. We are to value, we are to recognize that all human beings are made in the image of God. And we are not to despise that image. If you go back to Genesis chapter 9 and verse 6, where God has said to Noah, look, you can kill and eat any animals you like. All living things I give you to eat if you want to do so. And then he adds, but not human beings. Not human beings. And he says, whoever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God he made man. And this is the reason we must not despise others. We must not criticize others unnecessarily. Criticism is sometimes necessary. But we do so with the consciousness that every human being, even our enemies, and even people who have done awful crimes, they are nevertheless made in the image of God. And we must always bear that in mind when we look at another person and make comments about that person or have thoughts about that person even, that we are thinking of and speaking of someone made in the image of God. We must respect that image in all men, whoever they are. Well, that's a great application, very challenging one, of course, to us today. Well, now I'm moving on to my next point, my second point, having dealt with those issues of the plan of Haman that he is pursuing. My second point was the Jews petition God. There was, of course, when Haman's edict was published, there was immediate shock, horror, fear, anger, an outcry by the Jews. And as that edict was distributed throughout the Persian Empire, this shock and horror and fear took hold of Jews in every country. It was even translated into their own languages to make quite sure they understood that they were the target of this genocide plan. And we read here, of course, about Mordecai, the Jew, who was the person who had brought up Esther. He was, in fact, a cousin of Esther, but about 20 years older, and he had brought her up as his own daughter. And Esther, of course, had, in various wonderful ways, by the providence of God, become queen of Persia. And Mordecai looked after her still, kept in contact with her, had meetings with her on a regular basis. But now he put on sackcloth and he couldn't meet with her. He wasn't allowed into the palace grounds. He couldn't go and see her. So everything from this point onwards had to be done by messages carried by servants to and fro between Mordecai and Esther. And let's first of all say something about sackcloth, ashes, and the like. Mordecai couldn't enter the palace grounds because he was wearing sackcloth. Sackcloth was made of the hair of a mountain goat, and it was worn as a kind of self-punishment by anyone who wanted to indulge in that. And it was worn with the hair against the flesh, extremely uncomfortable. Sackcloth and ashes, well, that signified the loss of all things, loss of hope, sort of thing that you would get if a person's house burns down and nothing is left. All he's got are ashes. All his possessions and his property have been destroyed, nothing left. So sackcloth and ashes were symbolic, but I think to some extent we must treat them as irrelevant here, because wearing sackcloth and putting ashes on your head or sitting in ashes was a cultural feature of the entire ancient world. The Jews didn't invent it. It was practiced throughout, virtually throughout the whole of the ancient world in pre-Christian times. And it was cultural. It was an outward demonstration reflecting the inward feelings and fears and thoughts of the individual. An example of that makes it rather clear and brings us to the point of petition in Daniel chapter 9 and verse 3. Daniel, of course, lived in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, which is way before the Persian Empire came into being. He wrote this: I set my face toward the Lord God to make request by prayer and supplications with fasting, sackcloth, and ashes. I prayed to the Lord my God and made confession for the sins of his people. But nevertheless, can you see here that what Daniel was doing was praying. He was praying, and he happened to do it with the cultural signs of sackcloth, ashes, and fasting. And what we find in the book of Esther is that the Jewish people were fasting. Fasting was their immediate response to this threat of utter destruction. But I want to suggest to you that fasting was only a means to intensify prayer. Fasting and prayer, when people were fasting, when people in the Bible were fasting, they weren't just sitting around feeling hungry. Why were they fasting? They were fasting to concentrate their whole being, their whole mind, all their time upon petition, upon prayer. And so the reaction of the Jews to this threat of destruction was to fast, meaning, signifying that it was to pray. And that, I think, is very important. Their response was varied: anger, fear, and so on, but primarily and significantly and meaningfully, the purpose of fasting is to demonstrate that prayer is sincere, heartfelt, and urgent. And prayer was offered. It was offered throughout the Persian Empire. As the news reached the Jews, they fasted, which means they prayed. And Esther herself, of course, asked and in fact demanded that a special fast be held for her as she tackled this clearly daunting task of going to the king. The interesting point here is, of course, that everyone in the Persian Empire apparently was being acquainted with the edict that Haman had produced, an edict which demanded the destruction of the Jewish race. No one told Esther. No one told the queen. And I think that was quite deliberate, because Haman was well aware that King Ahasuerus was a fickle man, that he could change his mind easily, and he didn't want Esther getting involved. He didn't want Esther to know that this edict had been written and distributed. And so when he heard that Mordecai was wearing sackcloth, she thought, well, I wonder what happened to his regular clothes. I send him some new clothes. So she sent some new clothes to him. And then, but he refused to put them on. And then she had, and this was a messenger going to or from between them. Messenger came back and said he won't put them on. And then Esther sent him back to find out why he won't put them on. And it was then that Mordecai gave to the servant a copy of the edict, and he took it back to Esther. And in doing so, he made a demand, and this is the third point. Esther and Mordecai prepare their defense. In chapter 4 and verse 8, Mordecai commands Esther, after all, he was her putative father, and she had always obeyed his word. Mordecai commands Esther to immediately intercede with the king. You're the queen, go to the king and tell him about this. Tell him to put a stop to it. But Esther then replies that it is not quite as simple as it seems. She did not have instant access to the king. She, like anyone else, could only go to the king when he called for her. And there was a courtyard chamber immediately outside the king's throne room, and the king could see who was in that chamber. And if anyone appeared in that chamber who had not been called by the king, they were put to death because they had insulted the king. And there was only one possible relief, that if the king saw somebody in the chamber and held out his golden scepter towards that person, and that person touched the golden scepter, then that person could enter safely. And the king would hear the petition, the request, or whatever it is that was being brought. And so for Esther to just go straight to the king, it was not a straightforward matter. And she explained that she hadn't been called by the king for some considerable time. And she couldn't just walk in to the king's presence. And she was a coward. Was she afraid? Well, I think Mordecai had that impression. He thought it was a reasonable fear of death that prevented her from doing what he ordered. But I don't think that's the case, because she shows later on that she's perfectly willing to die, if necessary, to save the Jews. I think what she was doing is being realistic. She was willing to risk death, hoping, of course, that the scepter would be extended to her, but she knew that there was a problem here. Even if she was accepted, and she did go into the king, and he said, "What is your request? Ask me, I'll give you anything up to half of my kingdom," which was quite a formula. It wasn't really meaningful. And what is your request? Esther realized that the king did not know that she was a Jew. He was ignorant of that fact at that point. And if she'd gone in via the scepter, gone in safely, and immediately disclosed that she was a Jewess and she was one of the threatened people, she did not know how the king would react to that. He might accuse her of effectively lying to him by withholding from him the fact that she was a Jewess. She never revealed that. And she might, if he felt that way, if he was angry with her for never telling him, she might in fact find that the king backed Haman rather than her. So she knew she couldn't just walk straight in and face up to the king on this issue directly. Then in verse 14 of chapter 4, Mordecai sends to Esther what I have called a prophetic message. And I believe it was prophetic in the sense that God gave Mordecai that word. And it's possibly the best known comment or phrase from the book of Esther. And Mordecai sent to Esther a message. Who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And then something rather amazing takes place. Strengthened by these words, I call them prophetic, come from God, strengthened by these words, Esther actually takes control of the situation, and her response is to give orders for 3 days of fasting and prayer. She decided to go to the king unbidden, and she gives instructions to Mordecai. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther commanded him. And I think the application here is that Esther took control of the situation because she couldn't do anything else. Mordecai couldn't go anywhere near the king, couldn't enter the palace. Mordecai had nothing he could do to help save the Jews. It was entirely in Esther's hands. And so she had to take control. She might not have wanted to, but she found herself alone. And there is another application there, because there are times when Christians find themselves alone. A classic example, of course, is the Apostle Paul in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 16 and 17. He says, no man stood with me at my last appeal. No man stood with me, but the Lord stood with me and strengthened me. This was probably a matter of days before Paul was executed by the Romans. He had a last opportunity to speak in his defense. He had an appeal, he made an appeal, but nobody stood with him. There was no other Christian willing to stand with him. He was there alone before the tribunal that would decide his fate. And he was on his own, but he said, I was not alone. For the Lord stood with me and strengthened me. There are times when we find ourselves in that situation. We're alone in the sense that no immediate help is available from any other source. And we must look to the Lord, because the Lord always stands by us. The Lord always helps us, and the Lord always gives us the strength we need to go through with whatever he has permitted, and to do so to his glory. So then there are some great applications there for us, aren't there? Let's bear them in mind. We have to continue with these studies next time I speak.